Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much. I hope that you found the history session hopefully not completely overwhelming, although I have to tell you, it always is overwhelming. History and law, hands down. There's so many facts, figures, and important dates and time and things of history that you need to keep track of. But I think it's an important thing to take into consideration to just really identify a couple of things. So we didn't get a chance to do that this morning, but we're going to do that now. I'd like for us to take a few minutes to think about what kind of student you were when you were in college. Think back to, and not like your freshman and your sophomore year, more of like your junior and your senior year when you kind of had it together. And I'd like for you to think back to how you performed best, right? So are you the kind of person that needs like to read something again and again to understand it? Are you the kind of person that needs to take notes, the audio to understand what the course matter was about? Or are you the kind of person that just shows up, takes a test, and aces it? If you are, please get up and leave. I was just kidding. I'm just kidding. I know that we all learn very differently, and I think it's an important, very important part of really identifying what your best plan of action is going to be to tackle the AICP exam. I think I made the mistake of really just like rushing into taking the exam, thinking that my years of experience and my education were enough to kind of get me through the hurdle. No, it wasn't. And I learned that lesson the hard way a couple of times. But I think it's also an important thing. Another lesson to keep in mind is that it's your journey, right? It's not intended to be something easy where I tell you my favorite color and all of a sudden I've won $1 million. It's intended to be a process. So I like to refer to the AICP or becoming AICP, or just generally kind of like the lingo, if you will be becoming AICP. So it's not about getting the 4 letters behind your name, not entirely, although that comes with the territory. But I think it really is about the experience and all the experiences that you have leading up to that big hurdle. And I think one of the things that I noticed is once I switched my mentality of this is not just checking a box, this is actually going through a process, and it's a phased process because you apply for the to be able to sit for the exam, and then you prepare, and then even when you pass, you still have experiences that will come after that, which is what you see here as well, that folks that have already become AICP, like Wendy, like the presenters that we'll have later, they continue to give back to the profession by helping all of us in different ways, right? And helping one another. So becoming AICP is a process, and it's also a lifelong commitment for however long you want it to be. So I think we need to really mentally kind of wrap our brain around that idea so that we understand that it's not just going to be in 7 weeks, I'm going to have my AICP. It's going to be, I'm becoming AICP, and this is the next milestone in the process of doing so. So keep that in mind. So we've already covered the planning history, which thanks to Wendy, we got a wealth of information. And I'd like to just remind everybody that I will be sending an email to all the folks that have registered with all of the copies of the presentations and the handouts that I reference. So keep that in mind. You don't have to panic. Don't take, copious notes entirely. I mean, certainly do that if that's the kind of learner that you are, but just know that that's not your only resource. So in addition to the emails with the copies of the handouts and the presentations, you also have in your email registration a link to our YouTube sessions, right? So our live streaming, you'll be able to refer back to these videos and take a look at them. So keep that in mind. And now I'd like to give you an overview of the exam. I think we kind of jumped in to the history session and gave you tons of facts and figures, which is great, just to kind of scare you, to kind of keep you on the edge of your seat a little bit. But I'd like to focus on the exam itself and what we have to look forward to, right? So, bless you. It's getting a little rowdy in the room. Okay. Okay, so first and foremost, let's go over our schedule, right? So we have committed to 4 Saturday sessions together, right? And it's half day. I didn't completely dominate your weekend, so you're welcome. But we have a lot of important subject matter to cover, right? And so important thing to note that this is not completely comprehensive, right? This is intended to be used, this tool, this room, this experience is here for you to supplement what your plan of action is going to be. So important to keep in mind, again, if I think back to my college days and I knew I had an exam coming up, which by the way, you get to pick your exam date. Yay. So a professor doesn't identify it for you. You get to solidify your like gloom day, but you also get to plan for it. So I think it's important to kind of think of, okay, if we know that for those of you that have already applied to sit for the exam, congratulations. It's a process in and of itself. And this training session is not focused on the application. We have other training sessions for that. This session or training is focused on the exam itself. So certainly feel free to reach out to me or to anybody that you know that is AICP if you're still in the application phase of the process. But our training is really focused on the exam itself. So our training sessions are focused on the subject matter. So as you saw Wendy this morning give an overview of planning history, you'll have other presenters. Each of the sessions, so every Saturday when we meet, we'll have 2 subject matters that we'll go over. And each of those subject matters will be covered by an expert in that area. And I will then, certainly help you with any additional resources that you need. But I think before we even get into each of these sessions on the schedule, also think about when is your exam date? So if you've already been allowed to sit for the exam, and now you're identifying, okay, now I'm able to sit for the exam. What do I have to do? Well, you actually have to pick an exam date. And you have to identify whether you want to take your exam in May, which is coming up, or in November, right? Or you can push it. You can actually push it to May if you already have been allowed to sit for the exam. And then the next step of that process is going to be your study plan, right? So if we've already identified what exam we're going to take or when we're going to take the exam, whether it be May or November, then we should also be selecting our date. And I'll get into that in a bit. But all of this to get you thinking of, as good as it is to sit and have this camaraderie and discuss things, you actually have to do things in order to prepare yourself for the exam. I know, newsflash, right? Like any good thing in life, you always have to work twice as hard to get it. But this training schedule, I will email all of you who have registered just to give you an idea of what we're covering, right? So what we're covering is, these important subject matters that actually relate to the exam content. So let's get into this. So you've already made a decision to get certified, right? Yay, big decision, because as you will often find, not everybody is a proponent of the certification. So I'd like to say that you're in an elite group of people that have opted to do it. And don't listen to the naysayers who say it's not worth it or it doesn't matter, or if you have an employer, who isn't necessarily a champion of the cause. Remember that this is a decision that you've made for yourself, for your own professional growth and development, and because you're the kind of professional that takes it to a higher level, which is to be certified. Now, I feel like I'm sounding like a very motivational speaker, but it's only because the journey for me was long and expensive. And now looking back on it, I learned so much about myself. And I had so many low moments where I started to kind of question whether planning was my thing, even after doing it for so long. But I think you'll have those moments, and you just need to stay committed to the cause. Make a decision of what you want in your life, like anything that matters, and then stick to it, regardless of who and what has an opinion on that. Okay, so you hopefully have already seen that APA National is like a wealth of information on their website. If you go APA National and just pull up the AICP webpage, you will see so many different resources, so many different, links to videos, to practice exams. So definitely have at it. And remember, this is an APA exam. So the more that you think like APA, the better you have in successfully completing that milestone. But there's also, yay, an AICP guide part 2, which is exactly for taking the exam. So congratulations to those of you that have already been allowed to sit for the exam. And now it's time to move on to the second big chunky book, which is the AICP guide part 2 for taking the exam. And the reason I reference it is because it's so helpful. It's almost like if you needed a Cliff Notes version of the exam, this would be it. It walks you through the process, not only of identifying when you want to take your exam, but also what kind of questions you can expect. Also identifies like when your deadlines are to register, to transfer if you have like second thoughts on like, this is too soon, I need more time. It also references the fees. And so I found it to be very, very helpful. This is actually an updated version. The older version included both information on the application and the exam. This one is specifically identifying each of these focus areas. So please be sure to check that out. These are important dates to mark on your calendars if you haven't already marked them, right? So we know that for those of you lucky folks in the room that get to take the exam in May, this is like super serious time for you, because you should already be like 10 steps ahead of where I'm kind of describing for the rest of the group. And so we have an application window. It basically is when you apply for the exam. The early bird deadline basically helps you to solidify if you are going to apply, that you actually get a response sooner than everybody else, so that you know that, you know, if you are going to take the exam, that you can actually start preparing for it earlier. If you don't know, if you don't have the time, or you're kind of feeling very confident in your responses, maybe you don't need to do the early bird. But there is an application process, and then once you actually get to sit for the exam, you actually have the option of selecting to take the exam now or later. So hence, you have a registration fee, which is also on the website. And then you also have a transfer deadline if you decide, I don't want to take the exam in May, it's too soon, I want to push it to the November exam. So just know that you have options. And then we have what is a testing window. So in the same way that we have an application window, we have a testing window. The testing window is basically, a time where you go to a standardized testing center and they will identify it. You actually pick your exam date. Hence why we always encourage you to select your date early on, so that you can, if you're one of the people that I know, which is most of the people, you probably opt to give yourself more time to study, so you pick the last date possible. But at least you know your exam window. And I think it's really important because you want to make sure that you pick a date that works for you. You have many options in terms of days and times, so you probably want to get in there, and it's really important to take that into consideration, because if you consider the magnitude of what you're doing and the fee that you had to pay in order to take it, you probably don't want to have to do it again. So be very methodical and strategic in that. And then so you'll want to make sure that you mark your calendars for these important dates for those of you that are taking your exam in May or planning to. And then know that the APA National website also includes these dates for the fall exam in November. So you will see that change in the website, whatever you decide to do in terms of taking the May exam or the November exam. So here, important things to note, right? When scheduling the exam, make sure that you register before the deadline, and make sure that you make a note of the exam window. And then know that you will actually receive an email to sign up for the exam appointment. So keep that in mind. I'm not sure who in the room has already taken or gone through the steps in this process, but it's just, don't be scared about it. And if you are scared, call a lifeline. Any one of us can kind of walk you through that for moral support, etc. I do see a hand in the room with a question, so we're going to go to that. Please tell us your name, your age, and no, just kidding.
I can go into all that. No, my name is Nate Schull. Just a quick question. I imagine the November dates will correlate with the same sort of timing as these in terms of registration and application deadlines. Is that correct?
Yes, to a certain extent, right? So they're still going to give you the same window of time in terms of it's still going to be like a 30-day window of taking the exam. There's also like a window of application. So yes, the May exam dates or timeline mirrors that you'll see in November. Okay, and then exam date. I know this seems really trivial, but trust me, you'll be remembering these tips and tricks day of the exam, unless you're totally freaking out, which is totally another option. Um, so, exam date. Make sure that you arrive early. It's just kind of like a job or an interview. And don't, in this case, you're not arriving early to, make sure that you look good in front of somebody else. It's mostly just so that you don't appear and like get yourself all frazzled, because I don't know about you, but when I take the exams or when I do something really important, if I'm like running late and frazzled, I'm already feeling like I've lost half of the battle. So don't do that to yourself. Set yourself up for success. You're also required to bring 2 forms of ID. I know it's super serious business. They obviously want to make sure that if you say that you're Lorena Cordova, that you are and not some crazy person. Although, in my case, it's both, right? And you really need to make sure that you take the time to do these things when you're not completely frazzled, right? So don't wait for the night before. Don't wait minute of. Make sure that you do this ahead of time, so that if you're really spazzing out, make sure that it's associated with the actual exam, not with some trivial stuff like this. You don't need to bring a calculator and a scratch paper. They're already provided to you. Also, make sure that you bring your watch and a sweater, because it's a standardized testing center. So the experience, as some of the presenters will kind of share with you, is interesting. If you get too hot normally, if you get too cold, you'll want to just make sure that you can adjust your own body temperature, and that doesn't distract you from the actual, task. And then take no books or reference materials, because you can't bring them in. So it's really comes down to just you and your brain having alone time. Serious business. It's a computer-based exam, so it's a 4-hour exam. It starts with a 15-minute tutorial, and if you do that ahead of time, that would be awesome, and you actually can. So just know that you don't have to sit through the 15-minute tutorial. You can do that ahead of time, and then you'll be all up to speed so that you don't waste any time the actual exam date. It's 170 questions. 150 really count towards your exam, and then 20 questions are just kind of like, they're not going to be graded. They're not going to count towards the test. But you don't know which those are. So you kind of have to show up and be actively focused on each of them. It is a scaled score. A 55 or greater is passing. So very interesting experience to keep in mind, right? So I'm going to keep going. Because it is a computer-based exam, you will have an option to mark questions and also to skip questions. And then you'll have a review feature at the end. And there is an online tutorial. Again, this link will be emailed in your, basically the PowerPoint presentation will be emailed. So you'll have this link so that you can kind of go through the motions of that. And if you're clear of mind, you probably want to do that sooner rather than later, just so you know what you're getting into, because you won't be clear of mind for too long after that. This is what it kind of looks like. Actually, it is what it looks like. So it tells you, it gives you an option. You'll see these buttons that say, to mark a question, mark it. To unmark it, you click the marked. Again, you'll have an option to review later or to skip it. And then towards the end, before you submit, you actually get like that question of like, would you like to review anything else? And at that point in time, you probably shouldn't, right? No go to second guessing yourself. At this point, just commit. But however it is that you want to approach it, just know that there is a tutorial. That's very important. And then 2, that you can do it ahead of the exam. And then 3, it's a standardized computer, based exam. So this should feel very comfortable and familiar to you. Okay? Okay. This is the layout of the review page. So you'll see, the questions are shown, and then it shows you which questions you've actually marked, which ones you've actually completed, which ones you've skipped. And you probably, again, want to think to your exam experience in college and what that felt like. So, I know the presenters will have information for you, but I think it's one of those things where you kind of have to be your own checks and balances and check your gut on some of these actions. The review features, you review all, you review marked, or you review incomplete. So again, just something to get you familiar with what that looks like. The exam areas. So this is just a breakdown of the high-level items of the exam. So the exam has so many questions, right? But there's a percentage of questions that are dedicated to these focus areas. These are the focus areas. I will be emailing an exam outline that gives you an actual breakdown, not only the percentage, and the subject header, but also bulleted items that describe what each of those sections represents. I swear that probably once I was like knee deep into the study materials, I was way too deep into the material that it made me feel more confused and more overwhelmed and thinking that I wasn't studying enough. So you probably want to take a look at the exam outline, within the next couple of days or as a starting point, just to give you an understanding of what the focus of the exam is. So fundamental planning knowledge, 25%. We have also the ethics section, used to be 5% and now it's 10%, right? Because we all want to be ethical planners, and that's really important in our profession. That goes without stating, I'm sure. We also have 5% going to leadership, administration, and management. But then you see the bulk of the exam is plan making and implementation, and then areas of practice. This to me deserves like a moment, like a pause. Let's have a minute for that, because when I think about the sessions that we put together and the exam trainings and the study materials, I'm thinking in my mind history and law and how significant information there is in that, right? Like basically history and law just seems to take up a majority of my study time in my mind if I have to learn the facts, the figures, the years, all that was going on in that time. It shouldn't, because based on the exam outline, we see here that fundamental planning knowledge is 25%. So really the bulk of it is in the plan making and implementation and the areas of practice, which means that a majority of the exam, it's based on what you're doing. It's today. It's like you in your professional realm, right? So it's not just about memorizing facts, figures, and history. That's a component of it, and apparently 25%. But the rest of it, 60% of the exam, is focused on what you know as a professional planner. And so that's kind of where you see that we, in our study sessions and the materials, it's hard to actually teach applied knowledge that you will only get through years of experience. And also in kind of having a plethora of planning, area expertise. So I say that because I think we make the mistake of thinking when we sit here or in the video, live stream the video, when you're sitting here listening to the presenters for law and history, I think it's an overwhelming amount of information, and you're thinking, how the heck am I going to memorize it? How am I going to keep it straight? And yes, it is important, but it is not all of the exam. It is a portion of the exam. And so you need to be strategic with how you identify your time and your resources and what your study plan is going to look like. I do find that for those that have just recently graduated college, it's probably something where the planning, history, and law is something that's very fresh in your mind because you just recently got exposure to it, right? It's fresh. For those of you that have been out of college for a while, then it's probably not going to come as easily, right? And you'll probably want to spend a little more time on that. But there's a method to the madness on everything. I think the important thing to take away is in the exam outline, the reason why it's important to look at that and understand it is because you need to have big picture of what the exam is potentially going to cover, right? So if you have a bigger chunk of the exam dedicated, it has a bigger percentage, then you know that you should have much more knowledge and resource in that area so that it could also help you kind of allocate your time. Okay. The exam focus. So again, the knowledge, 40%, right? Based on just your history, your law, your ethics, the demographics, which we'll cover in some of the sessions. There's a lot of information to try to memorize and understand, but skills is really going to be 60% of it. So your actual work, your areas of practice. So keep that in mind. And then exam scoring. So scoring reports are only available to you. So thank goodness that your employer doesn't get a chance to look at your score results if you should fail, which hopefully none of you fail. But if it does happen, this is, you're basically sitting in front of a computer and you finish, they ask you for a survey before they actually give you the results, which I think is cruel. You're like 6 months of my life and then I have to wait until I take the survey to get my results. But the results themselves, they're only available to you. So you're the only person that's going to be aware of whether you pass or you fail, right? And then, newsflash, if you do fail, they actually give you a results. So it breaks down the areas that you did not do well in and how many questions you got right or wrong out of that area. So at least there's sort of an indication of, okay, this is where you were at, try again. Okay? But hopefully the rest of you will be like, yes, I passed. And that'll be the best 1 minute of your life. No, until the next best 1 minute comes to your life. And then we do, we do receive notifications of candidates who pass the exam because we all want to celebrate in the progress of our sections or of the profession. But that only comes like months later after you've already kind of, settled in with this idea of like, I failed, shoot, or I passed, yay, like the whole world needs to know. So if you passed and you told half of the world, then we still would not know through APA National. We would only know probably like 6 months down the road when you told us, if you didn't already tell us. So just keep that in mind. It's confidential. It's all about you. And like I said, it is a scaled score system. So, some questions will be worth more than others, and it's not the same one exam. So, Elizabeth and I may be taking the same exam, but we may have completely different questions. So just keep that in mind as well. And then, like I said, immediate notification. So at least you know for next time, and you don't have to wait. It's not a long and arduous process to get the results of whether you successfully took on the endeavor or whether you need to try a little harder. And tips and suggestions. So these are my general tips and suggestions. As you'll hear from the rest of the presenters, everybody has like a method to the madness, and these are all wonderful people. And at some point or another, you too will be ready and willing to give back because of the experience being so enriching, I think, regardless of whether you pass or fail. But so one, talk to other AICP planners. I find that there is just so much desire to give back. Every now and then when I talk to somebody that it's, whether it's a problem area in planning or an issue that I'm having with the organization or something, I usually look to other planners just to be my checks and balances. Like if we have like an issue with a project, I'm like, what do you think about this? Same goes for taking the AICP. Find somebody that has taken the AICP exam, and you'll see that our experiences vary, right? So some of you may have, I actually can share with you that I know of somebody who didn't study for the exam. A good friend of mine didn't study for the exam. And I was constantly encouraging them to come to the training sessions. Even before I was involved, I was like, I found it really helpful. Da, 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 da. They didn't. And they maybe studied a little bit. And then, by a little bit, I mean like a month before, they took the exam and they passed. I am amazed. And I told, my friend, I was like, I don't like to share your story because like, it's like the 1%. Like everybody else has to study forever, and it's a lot of work. But by talking to other folks that have the AICP credentials, you get just a wide range of experiences and tips and tricks and resources. But before you start engaging with folks in the topic of AICP, remember, you start with yourself first. So what kind of learner am I? When do I want to take the exam? I'm putting together my study plan based on my own study habits. And then go out and talk to people and get a better understanding of whatever it is that you need to supplement in your preparation for the exam. Study groups. So study groups are sometimes beneficial and sometimes not, depending on the person that you are. Again, I tend to not do well in groups. I actually did a study group with a couple of people at my office, and I thought I was ready for the exam, and I wasn't ready, and I didn't have a good grasp of the material. And then I realized study groups are not for me, but I learned the hard way. So I want you to keep that in mind. If you're a study person and you learn better when you hear it from other people, then maybe that's an approach that you use. If not, then just stick to your own way of doing it. I do know that the study group benefit is if you're, for example, in transportation planning, and then, or if you're in private sector and you need that public sector experience to sort of give you like a comprehensive approach to planning, then you'll probably want to connect with somebody. And it's really important to utilize, your resources in that way. So if you have, as you'll see, you'll develop your own study plan and you'll identify what resources are the most appealing to you. But then you'll actually have to identify, okay, what are the areas that I need to supplement, right? So you won't find a resource that is all encompassing. Not the sessions, not the AICP binder, not the Plan Edison course, if you take that. I mean, you have to use a number of different resources, and that includes people, right? So keep that in mind. You have to supplement because there's a lot of information to cover. Also, you want to rely on your experience as a planner to a certain extent. Keep in mind that this is not, and you'll hear this actually being said again and again, which is the AICP exam is not a California-based exam, right? It's intended to be for the planner in, Portland, Oregon, and also for the planner in Miami, Florida, and also the planner in Salinas, California, or, Fresno. Hello. But it's really intended to remind you that CEQA doesn't exist, APA National, right? So those are things to keep in mind, that you're relying on your experience as a planner, but not state specific or not city specific. So don't think of how you approach a planning commission, issue or an issue that's controversial with your city council. Stay positive. Like I said, I was not successful at my first attempt, and I think it was a process and an experience for me. I was questioning whether or not I should continue to be a planner after failing, and also after even just starting to study, I felt overwhelmed with the amount of information, and so it really made me kind of second guess myself. But you all need a lifeline, so identify somebody in the room to do that for you because you will need the moral support. But really, just stay positive. It's a process, and we all know it, and it's kind of one of those things where everybody can relate to it once you've gone through it. The exam statistics. So just caution, we try to help you prepare as best as we can. But you know yourself better than we do. So we are just here to help in your process of becoming AICP. And we will provide you with as many resources, as many contacts as we can. We are also, just trying to make sure that you have what you need, but you probably should spend a little more time and energy on identifying where you're at in your career, in your planning experience, in terms of understanding planning globally. And then identify the resources. So start with you first and then kind of work through the resources or the lifelines that you get. Look at percentage emphasis by topic. So big mistake, right? Again, I just wanted to emphasize, when you sit through these sessions or some of the courses or some of the materials, it makes it seem like the most overwhelming information is probably from history and law. I've sat through these sessions time and time again. I've seen the effect that it has on people. So make sure that you go back to the exam outline and look at the percentages. Don't be distracted by other factors. Keep that in mind. At the end of the day, APA National says these are the percentages that we're going to test you on in these subject areas. So stick to that because it's an APA administered exam. Flashcards. That's really, for me, it's so key. Actually, I used a lot of flashcards, and then Carolina, actually, I know she had shared that she actually did a voice recorder, right? So she would play that throughout the course of the day of, like, for example, when you're trying to memorize facts, figures, and important people in history, there's a Pennsylvania APA has like a breakdown of like important dates and people, and that's, I think, the best kind of resource for a timeline and understanding history. And I used it, and then I created my own note cards, right? But I know Carolina actually, she suggested recording her voice and basically hearing it again and again, because maybe you're an audio person. So different people need different things. So keep that in mind. Just be creative about it. And I did actually do the AICP Code of Ethics too, because some of that you'll see is memorization and other is actual scenario based. So it's good to kind of find a partner in the room and then, kind of have an ethical dilemma, because you get a lot of those on the AICP exam. And then take practice tests frequently. I cannot say this enough, because you don't know how bad you're doing until you actually take an exam, a practice exam. And you'd rather get a practice exam instead of, $100 later finding out that you didn't do well on the exam. So keep that in mind. And then Again, to reiterate, it's a national exam, not California centric. So take your California planner hat off briefly, or just, put it to the side, or keep it there, but just be objective about it. And then I'd like to note that I am a lifeline. We're all super busy, but it's important to kind of make connections and make time. So if there's anything that I can do, I think, an email or a phone call. The week's kind of crazy. So, but I'm a lifeline. But just know that everybody in the room is also a lifeline. The presenters are a lifeline, and you'll see they will provide you with their contact information as well. And you can reach out to them depending, again, on if you identify with a certain presenter or you know that subject matter is something that is unfamiliar and uncomfortable to you, then maybe you reach out to that person. So there's a number of different resources. So I would reiterate that. And then I do want to say thank you. Just going to take a moment to say, we have put together these sessions since as long as I can remember. I think that if you've been in the San Diego section, you've seen this session or the AICP exam training offered year after year after year. And we're fortunate enough to be able to offer it. I think it's important for us to make sure that at the end of the day, we help you in the room, but also try to get as many people the help that they need throughout the state as they're becoming AICP. And so this partnership with the central section is very important. You have areas in the state that are not so fortunate to have, these sessions within close drive of their homes or their jobs, or very convenient, or also to have the wealth of information that we have with our presenters. So I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that we try to every year do a better job of getting AICP information out to folks. And while it has, its hurdles in the process, one, I'd like to say that I can assure you that we all try to do our best to put these sessions together. There's always room for improvement and feedback, and I will be asking that at the end of all of the sessions. But I think just keep in mind that we're volunteering our time. We're trying to be here and show up for you in a number of different ways, and for those that are trying to become AICP. So keep that in mind as you kind of deal with our kookiness or our AV and IT problems, because each of these sessions will, I'm sure, have a little bit of that. But we have the best of intentions of bringing this AICP wealth of information to you all in the room and all of those folks that are tuning in the live stream. So keep that in mind. And so I'd like to ask Sean at this point in time if we have any comments or questions. Okay, great. Okay, no comments or questions. Oh, Leslie?
I know that you talked about how this is your study plan and your schedule is all going to be dependent on the type of learner you are and how much you want to prepare. How many hours do you feel like people on average spend preparing? The average person.
Yeah. The average person will typically spend 8 to 10 hours preparing a week for the exam. Yeah. Well, typically, I'd say you want to start off with at least 3 months would be the minimum. But I'd probably say because of the wealth of information, you'd probably want to give yourself more than that. But again, it depends on the type of learner that you are. So, okay. So now what we're going to do, we're going to do an activity in the room before we we're actually going to do a 5-minute break, and then we'll get our next presenters in the room. And we'll start with, basically, we have 3 presenters that are going to share their experience about becoming AICP, and each of them will share with you who they are, when they became AICP, any exam tips, and also just, to recap kind of their AICP experience. And I think that we have a good variety of folks that you'll see, but also because I think it's important to note that we're all different, and so we all learn differently, and I think it will just provide you with additional information on that preparation experience. So we'll have Jana, and then we'll have Stefanie, and then we'll have Ricky, and they each will share their experience. They'll also have a presentation for you. And I think it's important to note that recently we had the AICP Candidate Pilot Program. And I think it's important to note that that is also an option for folks. And I think the one of the presenters will cover that process with you. But we in the San Diego section only recently had one of our educational institutions become PAB accredited. Which also affects, as most of you should already know by now, the application, years of experience in education. And I think that we're now just starting to kind of see this uptake, at least in our section, of the AICP Candidate Pilot Program. So while we don't have, a tremendous amount of information focused in our training sessions, we will have one of the presenters share her experience. And then also feel free to connect with me offline if you are in the Candidate Pilot Program, because I think it's fairly new, and I think it's a little tricky when you're trying to identify whether or not you do or you don't have the years of experience based on your educational institution being PAB accredited. But I think what it says is that APA National is just generally trying to create alternative options for folks if you don't already have the years of experience. I mean, it is a journey, it is a process, and now luckily there's this other option, which is to be an AICP candidate, as Stefanie will share. But I think what we want to do is just we'll do a 5-minute break for those live streaming, and then we'll get the presenters coming, and then at the end of all of the presenters we'll have a panel discussion and or Q&A for those of you that are live streaming and in the room. If you have questions, just jot them down while each of them are going through their presentation. And and so for those in the room, we'll actually have an activity. So 5-minute break. But now we're going to move on to our presenters. And again, we're going to hear from 3 different folks who are sharing their AICP experience. We'll start off with Jana, move on to Stefanie, and lastly we'll end up with Ricky. And then after all of the presenters, then we'll have a panel discussion. And then after all of the presenters, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you can just, for those of you that are live streaming, just keep sending them in. We'll make a note of them. For those of you in the room, just jot down your questions, and we'll take all of those at the end. Each of the presenters will share a 15-minute kind of overview of their AICP experience. These presentations I will also be emailing out to you so that you have their contact information and you can harass them till your heart's content. Okay, so first let's introduce Jana. Come on up.
I won!
She just said that she feels like she's on Price is Right. Let's make a note of that, please.
Noted. I also have never been a YouTuber, so this is exciting. A lot of us have been very educationally fueled lately and attended the APA public speaking training yesterday, and so this is now my practice. So please pay attention to my tone and my pauses as I present. But thank you for having me. Fair warning, I will probably navigate around my presentation a little bit because AICP fuels me. And there's a lot of lessons learned, so I may go on a few tangents, so I apologize in advance. A little bit about me. So my name is Jana. While it does look like Jana, go by Jana. I received my AICP November 2018, so a little over a year, and I took it right down the street, so I took it while living in San Diego. Want to just give you a bit about my background because, as it's been mentioned, the AICP exam is very much geared for kind of that generalist, but I have a specialty background, so that's where I'm coming at this. About 5 years of experience in planning. What I do for my occupation is I focus on active transportation and mobility, so that's kind of the sphere that I work within. Specifically, a lot of it is based in education advocacy. So I'm not working on infrastructure projects. I'm not generally working with developers. That's my background. My education is in landscape architecture and planning. So urban design is a bit of my root. So again, that's a specialty that I bring to the table. In the next slide, I'm going to be talking about my exam tips, but a lot of what I've heard today, I want to bring up a few other tips that I've thought of along the way. I'm sure Ricky and Stefanie will also bring this up. But the day of the exam, holy cow. You can probably hear it in my voice right now. There was a lot of anxiety coming up because I was replaying it all in my head. It's a 4-hour exam. I used all but 7 minutes. And that just stems from that's how I function as a test taker. I used the whole period. I stepped out with about an hour left to use the bathroom. I'm a sweaty palms test taker, so I need to like dry them off. Yeah. Thank you. It's a support group in here. So those are all, even the little things like that, it's good to know, down to just how your body reacts to an exam. So with that, I'd like to go into my actual test and preparation top 10 tips. So a reminder to yourself, you've been accepted to take the exam, so trust the skills that you have. You've already passed a really big hurdle in terms of people have already identified that you have the skills to take this exam. So every time that you have hesitation that I'm not ready for this, remind yourself that. It's good. We believe in you. Just keep going. The second is create a schedule and stick to it. So we all, for the most part, have jobs. So this is a very challenging thing to balance, studying an exam and working full time. So creating a schedule is extremely important. I do not have children. I was able to focus specifically on the exam and just my exam and just work. So I understand that a lot of us have different balances that we have to figure out. So if Saturdays are great for you, if after work is great for you, even before work, whatever that is, maybe you replace some of the gym time with study time. I didn't have that problem. I just went straight to exam stuff. There was no gym time to replace. So whatever works. Number 3, start broad. So we had mentioned the comprehensive comprehensive guide. So this will be brought up many, many times, and in my resources, I'm going to give you a graded scale of what I recommend. But this is really, especially for a specialized planner, your look at the whole exam and all topics. And so this is your backbone of your studying because it gives you this holistic look on what all the topics would encompass. It includes history and all of the exam sections that Lorena went over. And it generally goes in the order that the sequence on the AICP website captures, and they all pretty much follow the same order, but they're structured differently. So when you pick a guide, while it might not be the perfect guide, I encourage you to just keep following along with it because it's a big document, so that's going to be a lot of time dedication. And if you get halfway through and then change your mind, you'd have to start over with another one. So connections will come. Trust that. So as you're studying history, what a great one to start with, because I spent way too much time trying to get all those dates and things in my head, and I didn't have a natural way of understanding how it all connected to each other. But once you start reading your comprehensive guide and seeing how all these links come together, it'll come. You just have to get there. So trust that. Meetups are not overrated. I agree with Lorena that I am not a study group person. However, she's the one that recommended I meet with someone. So I did. Yeah, it was great. And a big reason why I thought it was great was because I was in a situation that my employer did not pay for my resources to study for the exam. So all the resources that I utilize and that I'll be sharing are free resources. My study partner had the luxury of having paid resources. So they were really up to date, really flashy, and she was able to share those with me. So it's good to have those connections for those purposes as well. Practice exams, it's several times up there, all caps, because that's the best study method. Again, you'll see different study exam frameworks and the questions are different. Resources, I share which ones I think were most beneficial for me. But first time I took a practice exam, I think I got 30%. Not great. Most people would say that's probably failing. So it gives you your baseline. And while that's really harsh to see and could maybe send you into depression with saying, where do I go from here? that's where you're starting from. You can only get better. And then keep taking them because it's your reminder that you are learning things. As you get closer to the exam, that was almost entirely how I studied. Because every practice exam that I took, every question that I got wrong, so it's multiple choice, right? There's 4 options for the most part. You should know every option there. Why is it right and why is it wrong? Because the question itself has really great content in it, but all of the answer choices are probably also telling you these are topics that you should be aware of. So a lot of this deduction is what's right and why are the other things wrong. So those practice exams offer a lot of insight. Number 7, study in the way that works for you. Just like Lorena said, most of the time I would shut the door. I was known as unfun Jana because I was not very social. And it was me, my double monitors, and a lot of papers everywhere. And that's what worked for me. Your social life will come back. A lot of people experience this. As we mentioned already, you're balancing a lot. And so you can get really down when you're not saying yes to a lot of the social activities that you typically do. But I would also treat yourself once in a while. Go be social and don't lose so much of your life while you're doing this. When you get stuck, seek help. So we're all resources in here. If you need a pep talk, let us know. If you need resources, let us know. Wherever you feel like you're not understanding housing or you're not understanding economic development, don't call me, but someone else can help you. And then leave time to review. And I mentioned an ice cream. There's little treats in there that you should have incentives along the way, but the leave time to review is extremely important because about a month before the exam, I stopped studying. I wasn't learning new information. It was entirely review because at that point, I don't want to cram any more new information. I need to just let it all soak in and trust that it's all in there, but we need to make sure that we can answer everything correctly. So I monitor my airtime. Let me move into my resources. So I mentioned comprehensive guides and how important these are. So all of these resources that I have up here and will be shared with you are linked to my Google Drive. So if you have problems, let me know. But I've rated them. So as I mentioned, you should stick with a comprehensive guide. I didn't, but you now benefit from my lessons learned. So the 2016-2017 CPC, this is a resource a lot of people reference. It's great if you are a reader and like just really kind of dense, comprehensive, a narrative, some would say. I need to get to the point. I wanted to get the facts. I wanted to get there faster. So I got about halfway through this and realized it was great for learning planning, but I wanted to know more about the statistics and the data and kind of get dialed down to what the summary items are. So I pivoted, and I basically read the plan as in notes and the 2007 Pennsylvania APA document in tandem. I had both them up on my monitor. They follow the same sequence because a lot of them do. And anything that one didn't include, I pivoted to the other, and I kind of built mine that way. So personally, I thought the Pennsylvania was the best document, but Plan as in definitely brought in other components. And Plan as in is one that they have a paid version that you can have the latest. The one that I use is not the latest. Thankfully, planning doesn't change overnight, so it's still great. And then practice tests. So these are 2 resources, highly recommended. I felt like they were most aligned with how the tests actually read and sounded. Some of the others might mention that a lot of the questions that you'll see on the exam are those really great, like the Roman numeral ones. So pick, how would you word that? Like the ones that are like, pick what's like the best options, and it's either like 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 1, 2, and 3. And you're like, great, this is way too many options. It is the worst, but practice it because you'll see a lot of them. But but these practice exams have those as examples, so get good at them. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and hand it over to Stefanie. But at the end, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.
Yay, Jana. Okay, so now we're bringing up Stefanie. And as I mentioned, Stefanie is actually going to give us a different perspective because she is an AICP candidate, which is also super noteworthy. Can we get an applause in the room for that? And so this is something fairly new. Definitely for the San Diego section, like I mentioned, we don't tend to have people in the region don't tend to have the AICP candidate privilege because most of us, if we are in San Diego, tend to be within the San Diego area are not. Just one second. So sorry. Awesome. That was cool. Thank you. So in the San Diego region, like I said, UCSD, SDSU, and these educational institutions generally are not PAB accredited. And we just recently, yay, hurrah, SDSU got PAB accredited, which is awesome. But I think that's why we didn't have a lot of AICP candidates in the region, even though the program has been up and running for the last 2 years, I want to say. And so I think it's wonderful that we have Stefanie as like a guinea pig. I'm so sorry. But because then she can share her experience with all of us, and then we can also share that information now for those folks that are actually actively enrolled and potentially soon going to graduate from SDSU. So definitely good to have this information out here, and without further ado, here you go, Stefanie.
Hello, my name is Stefanie Cervantes. As you can see, I am an AICP candidate. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself, and then I'll go into what the program is and to study tips as well. So I graduated with a master's degree from UCI in 2017. While I was a student, I had a couple of internships with different cities in Orange County, and I currently work for the city of Oceanside. I do a little bit of current planning, a little bit of long-range planning, and I actually just passed the exam 2 months ago to the day, and that was my thanks. That was my second attempt at taking the test, so I'll give you a little bit of my do's and don'ts from the first time as well. So as mentioned, APA, I first heard of the AICP candidate program at the 2017 National Conference. That's when they were kind of doing this pilot, putting that information out there. They were really pushing all that information to students at the National Conference in 2017. And pretty much what I guess a lot of the feedback APA was getting was that the exam is really, really good for people who have just graduated. A lot of people say they wish they had been able to, take their history classes, their law classes, in conjunction with studying, because it really is a lot of the material that we learned in school is on the exam. So they started doing this program so that you can take your test as a recent grad or as a recent employee without having to have your work experience. So you can enroll right after graduation into this program. Pretty much the first thing you do is you take your exam. Once you pass your exam, then you are considered an AICP candidate. And you can use the title. During that time, you are getting your work experience, your minimum 2 years or your minimum 5 years work experience, and you're also getting your 16 certification maintenance credits. Once you have both of those things, then you actually do your application and your essays, and you submit that to APA. Once they accept your essays and your application, then you get AICP. So it's a different process, but if you are a recent grad or you're a student, I highly recommend it, because literally a lot of the material I studied was my urban history class, was my law class. So definitely it's good to have all that information still fresh. So I'm just gonna jump into my study tips. Make a schedule. The first time that I took the exam, I had a very just like rough schedule. The second time I was like, I need to get serious about this. So I use colors because I like colors. And I knew that I wanted to study probably about 100 to 125 hours. The first time I took the exam, I did not hit those numbers at all. So I knew I needed about 100 hours to study. So this is broken down by the percentage that each section of the test has. You know, the 30%, the 25%, that's how it's broken up. And then it's broken up so that I could hit the total 100 to 125 hours. Each block is supposed to be about 2 hours, but it was my personal goal to do at least 45 minutes of studying a day, because sometimes I don't have 2 hours in the day to study. So my goal was minimum 45 minutes a day, but I was trying to hit 2 hours. And definitely give yourself rest. As you can see, I was taking practice exams every other week, because that was one thing that I learned the first time was I hadn't had to sit for 4 hours in like ever. Even in grad school, when you take exams, they're not that long. So when I was sitting the first time to take the exam, I was getting jittery. I needed to stand up. I was just like so frustrated, so uncomfortable. So taking the practice exams and forcing yourself to kind of sit for that long was something that I do recommend if you're not used to it. Like I still can't do it. So second thing, find a good study location. The first time I took the exam, I was studying in my apartment, and that was not working for me at all. The second time that I took the exam, I was actually studying mostly at work. I would get to work a little bit early. I would study during my lunch hour. My employer was really good. They understood that this is an important part of your professional development. So they were like, if you need to take, you know, some hours out of the day to study, go for it. So at work, when I'm on my desk, that is my go time. So mentally, I was already trained to, when I'm sitting at my desk, I am here, I'm learning, I'm, you know, I'm mentally prepared to take in information, to make decisions, compared to when I'm at home, that's my relaxed space. So that's why studying at home isn't always the best option. Also, know your study style. The first time that I took the exam, and I'll talk a little bit about this as well when I get to my resources, I was doing a lot of just like audio, videos, things like that. And I learned better reading. So the second time I took the exam, I was just reading a lot of the resources that APA has, and that's really what worked out for me. And a lot of the APA resources that I'm going to talk about, they have very broad umbrella topics, things like that. So I used flashcards to get the dates, to get the authors who published the books, all that like really detailed information. I put it on flashcards because those are the details that I was like, these are dates I'm gonna have to memorize. You know, first national park, first subway system, all that information, I put them on flashcards so that I could just, you know, while I'm sitting somewhere, pull those out and really fast go through them. Like I said, take exams, take lots of exams. For your day of, relax. The first time that I took the exam, I literally had a panic attack on my way to the test center. So just relax. It's not as bad as it sounds, but definitely get there early, prepare everything the day before, you know, have your confirmation numbers written down, have your 2 forms of ID, have your sweater, everything, have your snacks all packed the day before, so that that morning or that day you can just go off and do your thing. Definitely get there early so that you are familiar with your testing center, because you get to pick where you can take the exam. So definitely know where your restrooms are, know where you're supposed to check in, where you can park, things like that. And also register early. So I am a morning person, so I knew that I wanted to take the exam in the morning. The first time that I registered for the exam, I waited maybe like 2 weeks before the deadline. And by the time that I actually went onto the Prometric website, I had very limited options of where I could take the test at the time that I wanted. So I would recommend, especially so that you can set up your schedule, getting your test date early so that you can test where you want to test, on the day you want to test, at the time you want to test, because that center is not just for us. There's going to be people in there taking the LSAT. There are going to be people doing other certifications for med school, for all sorts of things. We just get that testing window, but there's tons of other people there. So definitely I recommend pick your test date early, and then use that to kind of go off your schedule. So my resources. So I actually use the AICP Exam Prep 3, which I don't believe you can purchase anymore. I think APA sent out an email sometime last spring or summer about purchasing this, but I do have a lot of the materials that are on there. I have them in PDF form, so I can email those to you or send links out to those. And the exam prep, the way that it was broken down, it was broken down per each section, and then in each section it was broken down into subsections. Each subsection had a PowerPoint presentation that was done from a professional APA certified, and these people literally came from all over the country, and they just sat down and did PowerPoint presentations that were recorded. But also as part of that, a lot of them also had these suggested reading lists. So you have access to all this material with your APA membership, because a lot of these are links to either the, what's this one? The past reports, the zoning practice, the quick notes. All of these things are available on the APA website that you can just go on there and link, and you have access to them. I also used the exams. Definitely, that was one of the better options for taking exams. I believe this is the same link that I got from you last year. So take advantage of those. Those are the best practice questions, definitely. I also use the APA podcast. I drive a lot. I have a long commute, so having the podcast was really useful for me, especially because they do talk about a lot of the current planning stuff. So it's really good to be up to date on the new planning policies that are coming up, the new kind of challenges that planners are dealing with nationwide. So having the podcast was really helpful. And then another resource that I forgot to put up here is that through your APA membership, you also have access to the APA library. And the library, not only can you rent out books, like electronic books from them, but some of those books also come in audiobook form. So very good for my commute. I was able to listen to the audiobooks, some of which are referenced in the suggested reading list as well. So you could just go on there and say, hey, is this book available? And you could go and like read the chapters I was telling you to read. So it was really helpful to have that. And so this is just an example of one of these, but literally it breaks it down even to the page numbers that it's suggesting that you read. And so there's literally like probably 100 of these suggested reading lists. And I have some of them printed out here as well. And then this is my contact information. Feel free to email me or call me with any questions.
Thank you, Stefanie. And I also wanted to make sure that I noted, so there are resources in the APA webpage that are specifically for the AICP candidate program. So if you're in that situation or in that scenario, if you're one of the fortunate ones, then there's definitely resources to help you through that process. And for those in the room, I have a flyer in the back if you are in that kind of category of being able to apply for the AICP candidate pilot program. So now I'm going to invite our third speaker, which is Ricky. And, you know, it's so funny because the folks that I ask to come and volunteer their time on a Saturday morning at 8:30, they're generally folks that I've met in the profession through just going to, you know, the networking events, the APA Planners Night Out, And also just in the day-to-day, so folks that you work with or folks that you meet for, if you're in the private sector or the public sector, you come across folks. And I definitely think that our community, our planning community is small, right? I think inevitably you're going to encounter somebody that's going to be your coworker, or in my case, it just happened to me actually that Ricky and I share a work day together. So, but I'd just like to kind of make a note that the reason it's important to be out and about and connect with folks is because everybody has a story. And generally, if you're in the planning profession, I like to think that we're all kind of aspirational and we like to make the world a better place. Whether we do or not, I'm not sure, but I know that we try. And I think it kind of is one of those things where the more that you go and meet people, the more that you'll hear people's experiences and the more that you know and extract from those experiences, not only for AICP certification, but also then for the lifelong journey that you're making in terms of the commitment to planning. So with that, I'd like to ask Ricky to come on up, and I'm going to hand over the microphone.
Hello. My name is Ricky Williams. Despite my stature, I am not the famous football player. I am an environmental and transportation planner at Ascent Environmental. I have a focus on just environmental transportation planning and climate action planning. And I have been an AICPer since November of 2017. And the reason I wanted to do AICP is because as I was going through school at Iowa State and at Cal Poly, I saw people in positions that I myself wanted to be in the future, and all of them had AICP. So that was kind of the motivation to get the credential and progress my career, because the people that I saw doing really cool things in the profession also had these 4 letters after their name, and I wanted to be like them. When I was studying for the test, I didn't really know where to start. I just kind of started Googling a bunch of stuff and showing up to classes like this to get an understanding of maybe where a starting point is for people. And for me, the best place to start was understanding what's on the test. And so Lorena did a good job talking about the different sections of the test, how each one of them is weighted, and then being in California, knowing that the test isn't about being a California planner. So you kind of have to put yourselves in the shoes of someone who is a community planner in a small town in Iowa, and they have to do everything, right? They have to know their zoning, they have to know their general plan land use, but they also have to work with developers and try to incorporate sustainability into their practices. So it's an all-encompassing exam that focuses on that planner that's going to have to do it all, that might not be specialized. And while that specialization is very useful, especially for some of these other sections, namely the specialization sections, it's not the majority of the exam. Another part of understanding the test is knowing how the test is formatted. So Jana hinted at, some of the questions are the choose number 1, or maybe number 1 and 2 are the best answers, so pick that. There are a lot of examples of how the test is formatted and how the questions are typically asked. There might be some questions that you get that have really long introductions, kind of like setting the scene for your I don't know what they're trying to ask you about a specific planning situation, and they might throw in a couple of items that actually aren't necessary to answer the question that they're asking at the end. So understanding that, there's certain things that you want to look for in each question before you go in is very helpful. Same with knowing the format of the Prometric testing system and playing around with the tutorial that they provide online beforehand. The second thing is that you are looking at these materials and you're probably like, holy cow, that's a lot. You're not the only one thinking that. Everyone that studies for this test is like, holy crap, That is a lot of information. There's no way I can remember all of that. And that's where having a study group is helpful. I don't want to say only study with a study group, because study groups are only as useful as each person's effort outside of it. But what makes a study group very useful is, as you're studying on your own, if you run into issues or questions or maybe a topic that you don't fully understand, you can come together, and hopefully there's people of a variety of specializations, and you can work out those details, figure out your questions, and try to expand your understanding of your knowledge based on what you realize that you don't know studying on your own. My third study tip is flashcards. Apparently we all do that, which is great. But for me, flashcards are really good for writing the flashcards. The way I learn is by writing stuff down. It's kind of a listening and writing is how I'm able to retain a lot of information. So going through all of the study materials and writing down on flashcards the names, the dates, the places, that was a really, really helpful tool for me to remember a lot of this information. The next study tip is connecting the dots. Jana also hinted at this, but and Wendy kind of hinted at this too, where planning covers this long range of things, and everything is reactionary to something else. So everything that has occurred in the planning profession was because of something that was happening in society and in our cities at that time. And as you're going through flashcards and identifying dates, you'll notice that, you know, certain movements and advocacy movements were because of this thing that was happening in our cities that were occurring because of this thing that happened before it. So when you have your flashcards, it looks like it's a ton of individual pieces of information, but in reality, it's just a sequence of events that if you're able to know, you know, certain decades, what's occurring and what the main themes are for planning efforts during those decades, that really helps you retain really large amounts of information, while just being able to be like, oh, I know a lot of the environmental stuff happened in the 70s. So I know there was the Endangered Species Act and Clean Air and Clean Water, and then everything associated with that was kind of around the same time. And so it kind of gives you you know, this happened then, and then you can take the ladder down to the more detailed information. And then the last thing is practice tests and practicing taking tests. I also started with a practice test, and the first time I took it, I was like super confident. I sat down for like an hour and a half and just breezed through like 150 questions. I was like, this is easy. And then I got my answers at the end, and it was like 40%. And I was like, I am an idiot. Like, there's no way I can be a certified planner because I got 40% on this. But that kind of gives you your baseline, and you just keep working your way up. And as you take practice exams throughout your study time, you will start to see incremental progress. And by the end of it, you're probably going to be getting like 80s, 90s% on all these huge tests. And that's kind of how you know that you're in a good spot to take the exam. For exam tips, the number one thing that I did was scout the location. I felt like I was like in Mission Impossible. I found a floor plan of the building that my test was in. And I identified where the testing center was, where the bathrooms were for there, where the nearest water fountain was. And that was like imperative for me, because knowing the space around you helps relax you when you're in it. If you're in the exam room and you're like, I really have to use the bathroom, you don't want to be worried about knowing where the bathroom is in the middle of this test. The second part of that for scouting the location is knowing what traffic is typically like getting to and from your testing center. When I took my test, I was living in San Jose, and my testing center was in the same direction as the primary commute, like peak hour commute direction. And so when I first looked at it, I was like, this is easy. There's no cars on this road. It was like Saturday morning, so obviously there weren't. But then another day, I went down the same road. It was like 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, and it was awful. You like couldn't go anywhere. So know what the commute is to your location and plan around it, because the last thing you want is to be stressed out in a car before your exam. When taking the exam, do the easy questions first. They give you the option to skip through stuff. And this is obviously something that works for me that might not work for everyone else, but as you're taking the exam, if you find that you get to a question that just has a lot of words and you don't feel like reading it yet, or if you read it and you're like, I have no idea what this is asking, don't dwell on it. Skip it. Answer all the questions that you feel confident in your answers, and then come back to those harder ones later. So that way, if you're at the end of your testing window and you know you've answered all the questions that you think are right, and you have like maybe 10 left, you don't have to feel as nervous because, you know, there's like a bunch of questions that you didn't even get to. The third one is build in breaks. This is something that also works really well for me in that I didn't need the entire 4 hours to finish the exam just because I'm a relatively quick test taker, but I needed to build in breaks as I was taking this because I can't sit there for, you know, 3 straight hours just clicking. I wanted to make sure that every 45 minutes to an hour I was taking time, even if I didn't think I really needed it, taking time to just get up, stretch your legs, get a drink of water, use the bathroom, and then come back to make sure you kind of have this like quick reset and that you're constantly refreshing your mind as you're taking the exam. And then another thing is scratch paper is your best friend in this exam. They give you just a couple sheets of paper and a Ticonderoga No. 2 pencil, and you have to use it if it's helpful. And I found it very helpful. At the very beginning of the exam, I wrote down all of these like conversions and equations on this scratch piece of paper during that 15-minute tutorial, which since I had taken the tutorial before going to the exam, I felt I didn't actually need to spend time on it. So in that 15-minute period, I took the scratch paper and just wrote down conversions for, you know, acres to square feet, how to calculate FAR, things that as you get stressed or mentally tired, just might slip out. And with that also, writing down questions. If there was something that you read in a question that you thought might be important for that question, but you didn't answer it, write that down on your scratch paper. So that way when you come back to it, you have a reference, being like, oh, right, that's what I was thinking earlier. Let's see if I can still answer this question based on my initial thoughts. And then the last exam tip is highlighting keywords. So the Prometric test format gives you the option to highlight information within all of your test questions. And I kind of mentioned this on the understanding the test, but they hide information within questions, and they also include information in questions that isn't necessary. So if you're able to just highlight what you think is important for answering the question, that helps you really narrow it down. If you skip it and come back to it, you can be like, that's what this question was about, that's the important stuff. Or if you keep rereading it over and over again, it kind of helps you narrow down the focus of what you're actually reading to answer the question. And then for my resources, my number one resource was friends. And this is just having people who are also studying for the exam to hold you accountable for studying. Make sure you can bounce questions off of one another, and try to surround yourself with some people with maybe different specializations and different work environments. I found it really helpful to have, I was working in the private sector, so I found it very helpful to have somebody who was working in the public sector to answer a lot of questions about things I didn't understand for like the public process and maybe how public engagement ties into, you know, a sequence section I'm writing. The second thing is I use the Chapter President's Council AICP exam study manual. Nailed it. And this is the link that I have included on this slide is basically just a link to the APA site. And I was in a study group where I received this study manual just as part of being in the study group. And maybe Lorena can talk to this because I might be on study material for this chapter as well. But this was a good way to, you know, get an overview of all of the different things that the AICP council presidents think are important to know for this. So this was my comprehensive guide to make my study guide and set my study schedule and make my flashcards was based on this. Then another big resource is Contemporary Urban Planning. It's a book by John Levy. And a lot of you probably have this from school. You might have read it in class. And if not, it's available at, I think, most libraries. I know here at UCSD it's available, and I'm sure SDSU has it. But this is a really good reference because it kind of covers the entire range of planning topics on the exam. So it starts with history, What you might not actually need to read, because there's a lot of other resources that are a little bit better and aren't books. And then it dives into like the specializations and then the process of planning and how planning operates at the local level. So this includes a lot of like the really detailed sections of planning that you can dive into, and it can help answer questions where you might have gaps in your knowledge. I took a lot of practice exams on planningprep.org. This is a free online testing resource, and they basically just have it's like a community-driven website where just a bunch of people put questions, and then they give you practice exams. But this is a good way to understand how questions are being asked for AICP, and to get a sense of what questions have been asked. So a lot of them, I guess a caveat to planning prep is the questions that they have are usually publicly released questions from old AICP exams. So some of them might be out of date. So you just have to keep that in mind for certain questions they might be asking about specific planning events or current planning trends that they might have shifted since then. But this is a good way to understand how much you know, where your gaps are, and how the exam works. And then my final resource is Planning Magazine. So APA's published magazine for every month. I started reading this like a year before I was going to take the exam, because the exam does include current topics and trends in planning. So my exam included questions about urban renewal in like Rust Belt cities, economic development for small rural communities, shoreline, coastline protection in Florida, and related to climate change. And so making sure that you have an understanding of current planning topics, and then also kind of planning nomenclature. So what are the common words that are being used by planners now? And that's stuff like knowing the different classes of bike lanes. Yeah, and it's a really good way to make sure that your knowledge is the most up-to-date knowledge that could be on this test. That is basically it for me. So now we will have the group question and answer session.
Thank you, Ricky. And I'd like to point out that Ricky writes climate action plans and does CEQA analysis. So I think just to give you a perspective, because so we're all different, right? And so I think once you understand sort of like, your area of expertise or your planning practice on a day-to-day basis, you also get a sense of who we are as people. And I can't tell you that I find a climate action plan very riveting or exciting, but but that just goes to show the differences among us. So I think what we're going to do, I'm so sorry, give me a minute. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to have a panel discussion Q&A session so that you all get your questions in for the presenters. And I'm going to kick it off with the first question. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, so we're just going to go in the order. Come on over here. Just don't be scared. Okay, so the first question that I have for the presenters, and you can go in whatever order you'd like, but the first question is, what do you wish you would have known before you took the exam? Like one tip that you wish that somebody would have told you before you took the exam.
Don't focus so much on history as much as you might, because it's maybe the least, you have the least experience with it, I guess.
Know your ethics. Really memorize the code of ethics. They do ask you very specific questions sometimes, and then they'll ask you some other questions as well that has to do, like, if a planning commissioner comes up to you and tells you XYZ, what do you do? So definitely know the ethics behind APA.
they have specific questions about like calculating FAR or calculating parking ratios. And the way that they give the answers are typically kind of a range different from one another. So for me, I got really bogged down on calculating the exact number that it needed to be for those questions. And I think for everyone else, it's good. It's a good tip to be able to try to be able to quickly calculate something or quickly do that analysis and just like understand what the range should be to pick your answer versus trying to pick the specific number that you think it should be.
I think one of the things too, you guys can keep that microphone on that end, have it float in. I think one of the things that was kind of interesting too, just, I mean, for all of these comments, so definitely, Jana, I've heard time and time again that because of the wealth of information that there is in the subject matter of history and law, that people think that it is something where they need to spend weeks on end learning and memorizing facts and figures. I have actually, because there is just so much in planning history and law that you want to, you know, just like make sure that you capitalize on all of it and remember it when you're sitting there and taking the exam. But I think one of the tips that I've heard, and I know that you guys have all heard it, is also to kind of lump facts, figures, and important times in history in like categories. So sometimes I got a couple of questions where it would ask me during such and such presidential administration, what acts, you know, these acts were, you know, enacted. And then it sort of tricks you because you don't know if it's asking you for the year or for the act, or if it's tricking you on the presidential administration. So it's good to kind of lump in terms of history, the facts, figures, and the timeline together. And I know that the APA Pennsylvania is a good reference for the history and the timeline, and it identifies, it's actually very, very easy to use, user-friendly, because it's color-coded as well. So, and that'll be, I don't know, for me, it was just very helpful. Can I get a head nod on that? Yes, okay. So APA Pennsylvania. And then I think the other thing too is in terms of the ethics. So ethics is 10% of the exam, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it is something that you should delve into. And while I think about the AICP ethics, code of ethics, it's maybe just a couple of pages, and you think, you know, okay, well, I need to learn, you know, books and books of history and law, and I just have a couple of pages for ethics. You know, how hard could it be? And maybe you save it to the last minute. Don't do that. Don't do that, because they have a lot of, I don't know, did you guys get scenario-based ethics questions? And then I was just all tripped up.
There definitely were scenario, and then sometimes it's verbatim from the code of ethics. So it's the low-hanging fruit that those are the questions that you should automatically get. So
absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
I might also add for the ethics that it will give you these very specific processes that we follow in AICP. So knowing the officers that you're supposed to contact, those very specific things that you're supposed to do if issues arise and who you're supposed to go through, that's the stuff that you'll need to memorize from the code of ethics. I think generally if you're a good person, a lot of the situational stuff is...
Most of us are not.
Yeah.
Ethical, but
if you're ethical, some of them, the answers are intuitive, but then the details of each answer come down to like that specific time frame that you need to report stuff, who you need to report it to, and where in the code of ethics it falls.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you all did this, but after I memorized it and I was like, I got this, I also did scenario-based questions with some of my coworkers, which was fascinating intel on my coworkers, but it's really good to kind of keep them in check, especially if they're also AICP and you're like, are you ethical most of the time? So I'm just saying that that's something to keep in mind. Okay, moving on to the next question. Oh, actually, we have one in the audience. Okay, I'm going to take one from Kevin.
What's up, Kevin? How you guys doing?
Hi.
All right. Question is, do you get the categories in the exam, or is it kind of all mixed in together?
It's all mixed in together, and so you actually have no idea what category. I mean, you can guess what category your question falls within, but generally it's all mixed together, and you have no idea. Especially afterwards, they give you the results, but you don't know which questions were which.
All right. Second part of my question, or second question, would be taking these practice exams. Do you see like verbatim any of those exact questions in the test, and you're like, oh, I already know this answer?
I know that happened to me a few times. It doesn't happen a lot, but as we mentioned, planning doesn't change dramatically, and so maybe there's a few words that are different, but yes, it definitely happens a few times. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I did get some questions that were literally like exactly the same, but the answers were different. And they were like the really basic questions like, what years were baby boomers born? Or, you know, what's the first national park? Like those really basic questions. The more complicated questions, like you had similar questions that came up, but nothing that was exact.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think actually my experience, so I took the exam a couple of times and I ended up getting completely different questions, and I didn't find my practice tests to be a mirror of the exam questions. So I think it also depends on your practice exam questions, right? So keep that in mind too, just your study resources. I find that the APA national questions were interesting but not spot on, so I almost want to throw you off to a certain extent. Like you think you know what to expect and then you show up and you're like, no. I'm sorry, Larry, do you want to take a
Yes,
question?
I know it's multiple choice questions, but are there true or false questions as well?
I don't remember. No.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so moving on to the next question. Okay, so I want the presenters to share the lowest moment of your AICP preparation, just so we know what to expect.
Yeah, you can start.
I mean, I kind of mentioned it, but my lowest was definitely the first practice exam I took, with just, you know, thinking I was like relatively fresh out of school and I knew a bunch of the stuff, and I was going through the test and I thought I knew everything, and then it was like 40%, and I was like, this sucks. I'm not good at planning. But I passed later on, so it's okay.
I'm gonna be honest, none of it was great. But I will say I did not go into the exam saying I'm going to smash this. Like, I'm totally going to get this, no problem. I definitely went in with hesitation and hoping I'd pass and hoping I'd prepare. Some people go in, they're like, yeah, I'm ready. Never experienced that. And so I think it was when I came across topics or subject matters that I felt like, as a planner, I should know this, but I didn't. And so you are kind of learning on the spot sometimes when you're studying, and so you're not totally confident in that. So you do the best you can, but those moments of maybe in that day that you're studying, you come across those a few times. That's not fun, but you get through it, and then you learn in the process.
Yeah, for me, I had a similar experience to Ricky, where I started taking the exams, and I was literally like, I think my first exam, I didn't even do 100 questions. I did less than that because I couldn't handle it. And then I went to check on my answers, and I literally had like 15%. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, what am I doing? But yeah, it's really much like I had already gone through the material, and I was like, yeah, I learned this in grad school. I got this. But when you're actually taking the exam, it's completely just different.
All right, Leslie has a question. I love that I know you all by name, by first name already. Scary.
So you mentioned that at the beginning, Ricky, you wrote down the calculations or the conversions you would need to know. As someone who is more in the policy world and less in like site planning, I don't have to do a lot of math on a regular basis. How much math did you encounter?
It's not a ton of math. There maybe you might encounter 10 questions total that involve actually calculating something. They're usually pretty simple. There might be like 2 or 3 that actually require you to know an equation or a conversion. But yeah, the reason I wrote those down was just because it's, you know, that's a very silly thing to slip up on, is just, you know, a conversion to square feet to acreage. So.
And just to add, I don't do calculations ever in my job, and so that was something I over prepared for, and I probably didn't need to do that to that extent, but it was writing down the calculations at the very beginning. That's one more thing, just get it out of your head. I think I got 1 or maybe 2 questions.
Yeah, so like I use math at work all the time as a city planner. So I was like confident with the conversions and all that stuff. What really tripped me up, especially the first time, was all the like stats that you have to do. They do have stats questions on there. And then also they had like economic development questions where you have to calculate like the LQ, the what's it called, locational quotient, and things like that. That was like the conversions and the formulas that I was like, what are these?
Yeah, I definitely think that you get like a variety of, and they have different versions of the exam. So as helpful as we can try to be, I think that's why it feels like a bigger than life kind of task, because you don't know what's going to be on the exam. You don't know which version of the exam you're going to get. So you just need to be prepared in all these areas, and you have no idea how many questions you're going to get in these areas either. Larry?
Last question. When you guys decided to take the exam, the preparation for it, was it like 3 months in advance where you said, you know what, I'm going to do Monday through Friday? Were there times where you were distracted, or you set your time after work and say, you know what, I want to do this? Because taking the test, anybody can take the test, but it's the actual preparation, because you can get distracted easily. You know, even coming here on a Saturday morning, there's
Thank you, by the way.
I am a very easily distracted person, so it was actually difficult for me to get into a routine. I studied with Jana a lot. She was doing the CITES AP exam at the same time, so that was actually really helpful for me to just have somebody else who needed to study something entirely different, but we could actually like schedule times to be like, let's just go to this brewery after work and sit there for a couple hours and work through stuff. Yeah, the adult library. It took me a while to get to that point. I was trying to study at my desk at home for a while, but you go home and you know, you get distracted. There's a lot of stuff that you would rather do, and you have to just like schedule in a time to go somewhere that's not your, you know, apartment and sit down with the material. And it helps tremendously doing it like either before or after work, because it's already a place that you have to go to, or before or after like classes, but schedule it around something that you have to do anyway. And then you can just tack on like an hour or two to each of those.
And we might have touched on this, but one really frustrating thing about studying for the exam is you don't know if you've been accepted until 3 months or so before you would take the exam. So you really need to just assume that you'll be accepted and start studying before you know, because that gives you as much time as possible. But with that, it's hard to be motivated when you don't even know if you can sit for the exam. So it's good to be diligent about that schedule early on and just stick with it.
And that's another reason too, if I can put a plug in for the early bird registration or early bird application deadline. The reason why we suggest it is because you want to be one of the first people that get notified so that you have more time to study. So if you can get on, if you're still in the process of applying for it, then it would be something where you really take advantage of having more time to study if you apply for the early bird.
So like I had my study schedule up, like my goal, my big goal was 2 hours for each day that I was supposed to study, but I knew that that wasn't entirely reasonable for me because life happens, you have to stay late after work, things like that. So my real goal was at least 45 minutes a day, whether I broke that up in 15-minute sections or one 45-minute session. And then the days that I couldn't study, because there was some days where I just couldn't study, I wasn't hard on myself on it. It was kind of like, you know what, you'll just get it done tomorrow. So definitely have a schedule, but also be flexible with yourself. Don't be harsh on yourself, because really, you know, if you're in a study group, people in your study group might know that you're not studying, but at the end of the day, you're really the only one that knows that, hey, I skipped that day.
I love it. Okay, so now we're going to go to the last, yes, I'm so sorry.
Hello again. My name is Nate. I have a question regarding the practicing in terms of meeting with friends and groups. I think all of you at least mentioned once that was a good technique. Were you part of a listserv or a headquarters or some kind so that people could message each other to meet up together, or is that just some organic, creation?
So the first time that I was taking the exam, I just went on a Facebook group for Orange County planners that I was involved in, and I was like, hey, I'm going to take the exam. Anybody else going to take it? Let's do a study group. And it started off really big. There was like 5 people, and then it like dwindled down. But it was still really good to kind of have that resource. And within that group, we started like a group email list. So that worked out for us.
And in San Diego, when it comes down to how many people are taking the exam, there really aren't that many. So Lorena was my resources. She was able to let me know who else was taking the exam, because I think in my class maybe there were 10 at most. So.
And mine came, I mean, my main one was just connections from school of people who had graduated the same time and were also taking the test around the same time. But another group came through a study session like this of just people who were preparing for it and wanted to take the exam, and just talking to them and understanding where in the Bay Area they lived. And so we just had a couple of San Jose people that we met up every now and then.
My name's Mary.
Hi, Mary.
Oh yeah, you may have hinted at this before, but I just wanted to ask it more directly. Are the practice exams like the same formula structure that you had highlighted earlier, like 10% ethics, 30% practice?
Not really. Practice exams kind of just, a lot of them are just an accumulation of questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think they really follow the exact percentage format, but they generally have all of the topics covered.
What I do remember is one of the resources that I know both of us featured, the WAKC, whatever, the W one. I remember that one is framed, so they're general questions, but they tend to ask a few questions more into one topic of study. So you might get more questions related to scenario planning. So you'll see a few more of those. So you get a bit more practice in a direct area, but overall it was a mixture of questions.
And then if you fail, do you have to reapply?
No, so actually I'll take this one. So fairly familiar with having this conversation with folks. No, you don't. You actually can take the exam 3 times before you are then forced to reapply. Yay. Okay, any other questions in the audience? Okay, so the last one, Sean, anything? No. Okay, he's giving me that look. Yes, you can.
I just, to kind of build off what Lorena was talking about for the early bird application, I actually felt I struggled a lot more with getting my application accepted. It took me 3 tries just to get my answers through, so they would approve me for the test. And that's what I found the early bird to be really beneficial, is that if you submit it in the early bird deadline, they will actually give you another opportunity to resubmit your answers if you don't pass it the first time. And they'll give you feedback on why they didn't accept certain answers.
Okay, so thank you for that. And so I think I want to sort of just conclude this with, give me the word that represents how you feel now that you're all AICP. One word, answer. And it could be a number of different things. It could be an emotion or a thought or whatever. I'm going to go with legit for
Validated.
me. Validated.
Legit, validated. I'll say empowered.
You guys took all the good ones. Yeah. Successful, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you to all of our presenters. And I'm going to have you just go ahead and have a seat. Thank you again. So I think what we want to do is we just want to thank you for coming to the first session of the AICP exam training. I will be sending out an email with the slides from today's presentation, also the schedule so that you know what's up and coming for the next couple of sessions, the study resources, and a link to the guide for the exam, just so you have that kind of as like your resource guide. I do also want to give you some homework, food for thought, and really I will be connecting with you like a mega harasser to start thinking of 1, exam date, 2, study plan, and 3, resources. So, and this is a group that will keep you accountable to a certain extent. We will have activities to make sure that you are staying on track. It is kind of like a support group in that, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to have activities to check in with you, and then you're more than welcome to check in with me. And then for those in the room, I want to make sure before you go that you and actually, if you're live streaming too, and if you're sharing the live streaming, make sure that you get the phone number of somebody in the room in case you're not able to make one of the sessions, and or in case you need a study partner, and or in case I fall off the face of the earth, which may happen and unfortunately has recently happened. So with that, I think that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. Greg, Sean, Jana, Ricky, Stefanie. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. All right, that's it.